Hey, what's going on? Welcome back to the James Kennedy podcast. I hope you've all had a better week than I have had, because my week's been interesting. I feel like I may have tempted fate on last week's episode when I said in the intro that my life at the moment is very un-rock and roll because I'm barely leaving the house and mostly what I'm doing is, writing my second book in a hoodie with a beard and eating cereal all day. And then I left the house and it all went downhill from there. Unfortunately, at this stage, I can't say too much about it because there's a legal process underway. But those of you who follow me on social media will know all about what I'm talking about. And for those of you that haven't got a clue what I'm talking about, rest assured I will be revealing all of the details in copious and consistent amounts very, very shortly. But just to give you a little taste, because it's not fair to leave somebody hanging like that. You can't say, hey man, some shit went down, but I can't tell you nothing about it. I wouldn't do that to you guys. So just to give you a little insight as to what I'm talking about here, for those of you that don't know already, your man here may or may not have been assaulted by 3 plainclothes police officers whilst innocently sitting in his car on Wednesday night. That may or may not have happened, depending on who you ask and depending whether that person happens to work for the South Wales Police Department. Of course, I have the injuries, both psychological and physical, to live with as a result of the altercation that may or may not have happened. But I made the fatal error of forgetting to take a witness and a camera crew out with me that night. So we shall see what unfolds as the inevitably pointless legal complaints procedure plays out over this week or however long it's going to take for them to investigate themselves and undoubtedly find nothing. But until then, I'm going to be a good boy. I'm going to, at least give them the benefit of the doubt to see what comes back from those guys, And when my cynicism is confirmed, then I'll at least be able to, move on from the waiting game and give you guys the full detailed story of exactly what went down that night. So hold that thought, because this is far from the last you're going to hear about it from me. But in the meantime, we're going to continue as normal and get on with the podcast as if nothing ever happened. As per usual, have you subscribed to the podcast or left a star rating or review? If you haven't, please go and do it now before we get started, and I'll love you forever. Now, today's guest is probably sick and tired of being introduced like this, but I personally think it's pretty damn awesome, so I'm going to say it again anyway. Today's guest is the youngest Member of Parliament, taking office 3 years ago at the age of 23. She's an old school lefty from a working class background, and she is most definitely fighting the good fight. We're lucky to have her inside Parliament, and we're lucky to have her with us on the podcast today. So from Nottingham East, Nadia Whittome, how you doing?
Hey, I'm good, thanks, James. How are you doing?
I'm pretty good, thanks, man. Yeah, I'm marveling at that awesome, very warm and cozy looking scarf that you've wrapped yourself up in there. I'm very envious of that. That was a very smart move. I haven't been as smart with my attire today as I freeze my bones off in a very cold South Walian studio.
It was the best purchase ever. I've got my office in Westminster is like a fridge, so we're all like sat here with blankets and turtlenecks and stuff.
Well, I guess that'll be good news to everyone listening to know that the MPs are suffering the effects of the cold as well. And you're not just sitting there in your gold-plated palaces with central heating and stuff,
Yeah.
So we're going to dive right in if that's cool. I wanted to start by asking you if we could get a kind of an MOT on where things are at currently within the Labour Party. Because it's a kind of age-old cliche, isn't it? That on the left, which is where I position myself, that we're mostly better at fighting ourselves than we are at fighting, the common enemy. And it certainly feels, from where I'm looking from, that the Labour Party has had a lot of this going on recently. The party does seem very disunited, like there's a lot of different factions within the party, oftentimes working against each other. So I'd be very interested to start out by getting your take on this as someone who's now been working within the party and within Parliament for the past 3 years, to get your take on what your feeling is about the culture currently within the Labour Party.
So I think the mood currently in the party is really positive. It feels like we're on the brink of a Labour government. Polling's been fantastic. And even with the poll bounce that Rishi Sunak's had, we're still significantly ahead. So people are excited for the general election, whenever that might be. And I think in a lot of ways, there's nothing like a general election and being on the brink of government to unite the party. I know what you mean about sort of party unity and some of the challenges that there have been, but the way that I think about this, I basically think that Labour's always been a broad church. We've always had people with different opinions who come from different traditions and different factions. And actually, I think in a lot of ways, that's kind of part of our strength.
Right.
because, like, as a party, we're a bit like a coalition where lots of different ideas can find their home. And if we're to win the next general election, we need to also win round a coalition of different people and different groups in society to vote for us. So I think it is in many ways a positive thing. But I guess the important question is how we deal with disagreements when we have them. It's not a problem having disagreements, but how we deal with them. And for me, that has to be through party democracy, through members organising, debating, voting.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I hadn't considered that, actually, because the left is a broad church, isn't it? You know what I mean? We say the left as if it's just this one specific thing, which, I'm sure the right would consider it that way to be. But the left, it does represent quite a broad range of perspective. So I suppose it would be unusual if that wasn't represented within the Labour Party. And exactly like you said as well, it's a great point. I mean, that's all very well as long as it's not functioning as a hindrance to the party's ability to function as an effective opposition.
Yeah.
And that kind of brings me on to the next thing I wanted to ask you, which is, I was a big Jeremy Corbyn fan and still am. I was part of the whole, Corbyn Mania fan club. And I see what happened to him as being an example of the thing that I just described at the start about, the left being better at fighting amongst itself than it is against the, the common enemy. So I'd love to get your thoughts now as, an insider, as somebody, working with inside the party and with inside Parliament, as to what your thoughts are on why that whole movement ended and what went down with Corbyn. I know it was before your time in Parliament, but I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are on that. What do you think happened there?
I mean, kind of taking it from the start of the movement, because that was so exciting for me and for so many young people, but not just young people, people who had been let down for generations by successive governments. And we had just an extremely cruel Conservative government at the time. I think we didn't imagine that things could possibly get any worse. And now here we are. And among that, there was the leadership election that Jeremy Corbyn stood in, and he was putting forward a different platform. He was opposing austerity. He was reimagining what our society could look like. And that inspired hundreds of thousands of people. And we saw that with how close we came to winning the general election in 2017. But unfortunately, we lost the 2019 election. I think there are various reasons for that. One of them, I think it would have been very difficult to win an election on Brexit. And we saw that with the number of people who voted Green or Lib Dem.
Right.
And I think the other thing, so I'm very supportive of the 2019 manifesto. There's not a single policy in there that I think was a bad policy. But I think the problem with a snap election is that you don't get time to build support for those ideas. And that's why it's important to be building policy ideas now and getting people behind them well in advance of a general election.
Yeah, 100%. And it's interesting that you mentioned people defecting to the Lib Dems and the Greens, because that's exactly what I did after the whole Corbyn debacle, was I defected to the Greens. I joined the Green Party, where I still am to this day, and it's a party that I really believe in and really support. But unfortunately, because of the electoral system that we've got, the first past the post system that we've talked about in the podcast on previous episodes, the reality is that the only party that can remove the Tories is Labour. So I'm glad to hear that, the party is a lot more unified now, because we have got to get these guys out, man. Of all of the issues affecting people's lives in society to do with, equality, poverty, the environment, justice, we can't tackle any of those issues as long as the Tories are in. We have got to get these guys out. And our only hope for that is Labour. So if you guys haven't got your game together, then we're doomed. So yeah. I'm glad that you feel that the party is unified and is ready to pose a strong and unified and effective opposition to the Tories, because we have got to get them gone.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that, of course, there are things that are priorities for me to be in the manifesto. There are things that I want us to be going further on. I think that democracy within the party is also important. Again, because going back to that point about us being a broad church, that depends on us having strong democratic processes in the party, because it allows us to debate our different ideas, to disagree but to do it well, and then to hopefully come out with better politics at the end of it. So that is something that needs to change. But I suppose that, as you say, all of us want a Labour government. We all understand that while we might have slightly different views about what that Labour government should be doing, what it should be prioritising, we can only do any of those things if we're in government.
Yeah, I had Kevin Brennan on the podcast a few episodes back. I don't know if you know him. He's the MP for Cardiff West.
Oh, yeah, he's great.
Yeah, he's cool, man. I asked him the same question, and he said to me, well, one day in power is worth 1,000 days in opposition. And, and it's a great point, because, I suppose it's easy for us, all of us, to always criticise the opposition, but it's only when you're actually behind the wheel can you actually affect, regulatory...
That's true. And Kevin has said exactly those words to me before.
Oh, really?
He's absolutely right.
I was really impressed, because I thought he rattled that off, off the cuff in our conversation, but now it appears he says it to everybody.
Now I feel like I've dobbed him in it.
You have, and I'm going to tell him. Well, Kevin is, he's an awesome dude, man. And I actually saw Kevin in September, because I was speaking inside the House of Lords. I've never been in the House of Parliament ever before, not even as a tourist. And I got invited to say a few words on a select committee hearing about, the music industry post-Brexit and that sort of thing. And obviously, Kevin is a big advocate for that issue. So Kevin was there, and he was brilliant as always. But for me as a first timer, it was just really weird being inside the place that I've only ever seen on telly before, and it's the place where, it's the room where it happens, you know what I mean? It's the walls of power. So for you as a 23-year-old to get elected into being a member of parliament, that's a hell of a gig, mate, and a hell of an achievement. And I'm fascinated by what your early experience must have been like, being thrown straight into that world. I mean, what was it like?
It was wild, and honestly, it was such a blur. It happened just before Christmas, so I was elected in the December 2019 election, and I remember thinking, over Christmas I'll have time to process this, and I didn't. And every time there was a short break, I'd think, I'll have time to process this then, because this whole thing is wild, and I just sort of never have. But this is just my new reality, my new life now. So right. Here we are. But I mean, when it happened, so I was elected by Labour members in Nottingham East to be their parliamentary candidate. And then I think it was just the day afterwards that the snap election was called. So that was mad. I was working, but could only get part-time work. So I was looking for other temp work. I wasn't expecting to win the selection to be Labour's candidate, to be honest, and I don't think anyone really was expecting me to win it. But no one was more surprised than me and my family. It was a lot for us to get used to. And then the election came on the Friday, or on the Thursday. I was not an MP. I was elected, had the weekend, and then on the Monday was straight into Parliament. And It was a huge culture shock. It was, I definitely felt like I didn't belong, as a lot of people do here, because Parliament wasn't built for people like us.
Yeah.
And that was something that I spoke about in my maiden speech, that I didn't come here to become part of the furniture. I came here to shake up the system, to be part of that change, and to amplify the voices of people in my community who haven't been heard or have been silenced by Tory politicians.
Hey, man, and good for you, man. Yeah, I mean, like I said, we're very lucky to have you there. But I mean, it just must be crazy, man. I can't imagine that, the age of 23. And I'm sure you've been there a few years now, 3 years in the game, so you're probably a lot more well adjusted to it now, and it's become a new normal. Would you say that's the case? Are you a lot more comfortable there now?
It still doesn't really feel comfortable, actually, but I don't think that's a bad thing. I think if you feel comfortable in this place that was set up to serve very different class interests,
right?
That was set up to be a place for men to work as well, not for people of colour, not for LGBT people, then you're probably moving a bit too far away from the community you're supposed to be here to represent. So I don't think it's a bad thing that I don't feel comfortable here.
Yeah, that's a great point. Well made as well. I mean, yeah, the second you start getting too comfortable slapping backs in the smoking room, then you know you've turned to the dark side, you know?
Yeah.
So you're in a really interesting position then, because you are, I suppose, an outsider in many ways. I mean, you know, you're not from a political background. You're not part of the landed elite. You know, you're one of us. You're from a working class background. So you've got an interesting and unique perspective on it all, I suppose, because again, you are relatively new to the game as well. So I'd be very interested to know what your observations are now that you're sort of inside the belly of Parliament on how true it is that a lot of people's perceptions about how Parliament actually functions. You know, in pubs up and down the country, there's all this talk about how they're all the same, you know, they're all in the pockets of big business, and, you know, politicians essentially exist to protect vested interests, not the public interest. And we don't really have any direct experience with that world to disprove that. So it's easy to be cynical. But what is your experience, having now spent 3 years in the belly of the beast, on how that machinery operates? I mean, is it mostly made up of hardworking people who are genuinely working for the best interest of their constituents? Or are you seeing the invisible hand of outside influence over some of your fellow members of Parliament? Obviously, I'm not asking you to name names on a podcast, but you know, what's your general feeling as you try to operate and navigate this new world?
It's very strange seeing it up close. I think I can honestly say for MPs on my side of the House that while we don't all agree on every single issue, because that would be impossible, and while we might come from slightly different political traditions, that people really are there to serve their communities and serve their constituencies. On the other side, I'm sure that there are plenty of people who perhaps came into politics for that reason, but they just have a completely different worldview.
Right.
And the things that they vote for are things that harm our communities and basically punish people for being poor. I see a lot of MPs who are we saw it with the lobbying scandal, didn't we? MPs who have big business interests, who are in the pockets of big business, and that's why these lobbying organisations exist, because they do it to influence MPs. They don't just, you know, wine and dine because they like their company. They do it so that MPs are voting for the things that they want them to vote for.
Yeah.
And from my experience, from what I've seen, that's very true on the Tory side of the House. And we saw it, didn't we, actually, with the Owen Paterson scandal, how hardly any Tory MPs voted against the government on that. They voted to protect their friend who had been found by an independent body to have broken lobbying rules. But then the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, tried to change the rules to let him off the hook.
Yeah.
And most of them voted for it.
Yeah, it really is a kind of us and them scenario with that party, I think, isn't it? You know what I mean? It's like they literally do represent the interests of the 1% demographic that most of them are cut from.
Yeah.
You know, it's just mental to me. I saw a picture of Jacob Rees-Mogg's house that he was raised in, and it's a castle. It's like a castle. And like, I know that's not his fault that he was born there, but it shows that they live in a different world. How are they going to represent the interests of ordinary working and middle class people when you were raised in a fairy tale castle?
Well, exactly. And it's like Rishi Sunak said that he didn't have any working class friends. And that's the thing, not only have they not struggled, but they don't even know anyone who has struggled.
Right.
They've got no concept of the impact that their decisions have on people. And it's a huge problem when you've got the richest man in Parliament, the richest Prime Minister in British history, implementing austerity 2.0.
Yeah, it's mental. I mean, I don't know how they've managed to maintain such a stranglehold for so long, such a long reign, you know what I mean? But I've got a theory. My theory is that it's because they play dirty, you know what I mean? And it's a lot easier to sell fear and selfishness and greed than it is to sell abstract notions such as, peace and equality and justice and climate change and workers' rights and things like that. It's a lot easier to appeal to those animalistic tendencies that we've got and to just scare people with the age-old scapegoats of, immigrants or crime or drugs or, whatever the hell it is. I think humans seem to respond way quicker to those kind of emotional triggers. And, the Tories, they just stamp all over those triggers anytime they want to shove anything through, even no matter how detrimental it actually is to most working people's lives. And it seems to work. And I don't know how any opposition can really effectively fight that without also playing some of the same dirty tricks, which nobody wants to do. So it's a very tricky one, especially given that the media are mostly on the side of the elite.
That's really well put. Yeah, no, I completely agree.
Phew. Well, speaking of Tories and their evil, there are tons of really urgent, pressing issues currently destroying so many lives in this country as a result of the reckless, lawless madness of these Tory criminals who've been destroying our country for so long now. So I'd like to hone in on some of those issues. What do you see as being the most urgent, pressing issues that we need to address in our society as a result of far too many years of this Tory madness?
So I think that there are these kind of dual interlinked crises. There's the climate crisis and the cost of living crisis. And also things that like the rise of fascism and the far right, which is extremely concerning across the world. And the kind of the people who benefit from these crises and the people who cause them and contribute to them are the same people, if that makes sense. Like, for example, the energy giants, the oil giants who are cashing in from the cost of living crisis are the same people who are paying their workers poverty wages, who are trashing our planet. And that's why I think actually the solutions are quite simple.
Right.
Like, we need a Green New Deal. We need a genuinely transformative Green New Deal that would create millions of well-paid green jobs in sustainable industries. And I don't mean just manufacturing jobs either, though those are obviously really important. But things like care work is a green job. I used to be a care worker, and it's an inherently low-carbon job, but it's not at all well-paid, and the terms and conditions are awful. So, yeah, creating those well-paid jobs and tackling the climate crisis at the same time. And that's something that I'm really passionate about. And I've been pleased to see some commitments on that from my party. So the Labour Party's pledged £28 billion a year for a Green New Deal, and also for 100% clean energy by 2030. We would retrofit 19 million homes. Like, imagine if the government had done that, if they'd fixed the roof while the sun was shining.
Yeah.
We wouldn't be experiencing the kind of energy crisis and cost of living crisis that we are now. And that would benefit, so it would benefit people's pockets because they wouldn't have to be paying through the roof just to heat their homes. And it would also benefit the environment.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, everything is so interlinked now. I mean, it's always been that way in a societal sense, but now it's definitely the case on a global level as well, in terms of all of our economies and trade and everything is interlinked around the world. And, our society has always been that way, regardless of what Margaret Thatcher said about society versus the individual, and whether you agree with that or not, the truth of the matter is that we are linked in so many ways and interconnected. And if in no other way than the global coming climate crisis, which is going to affect all of us.
Exactly. And it's harming working class people and people in the global south the worst as well, the people who didn't do anything or did the least to bring about the crisis. And that's from wildfires in Australia to floods in Bangladesh, God, even floods in Yorkshire, air quality in Nottingham. That's killing people.
Yeah.
When I think of my community that I represent, we've got very high levels of poverty and deprivation. So even before the cost of living crisis, more than 1 in 3 children in Nottingham East were growing up in poverty. I'm just so terrified for many of the people I represent, because 3 years ago when I first became an MP, I was already speaking to people, my neighbours, my constituents, people who couldn't afford their rent, who couldn't afford their heating, who weren't able to provide their kids with 3 hot meals a day. And now we've got inflation running in double digits. People's heating bills have doubled or even tripled in some cases. And wages and benefits just haven't kept up.
Yeah.
So it's ruining people's lives. And the government is just failing to properly support them. So I think I find that's probably what I find most frustrating about being in this place, that a lot of Tory MPs who sit opposite me, they just don't seem to grasp that politics has real consequences, that because of the decisions that they made, like austerity, for example, that caused over 300,000 excess deaths. That's people who died who would otherwise be alive today because of the decisions of this government and previous Tory governments. And it really is, it's life and death for people. It's not a game. It's not the Oxford Union. It's not a debating club.
Right.
It's not about changing the definition of child poverty and then saying that you've solved it, or renaming the minimum wage the living wage and then pretending that people can actually live on it when we know they can't.
Yeah, 100%. And well put as well. I mean, like, I think it's that disconnect, isn't it? Because they don't live in the world that their policies affect. So how can they have any grasp on the true reality of the policies that they enact? I mean, you've met some of these guys now. One of the things that I've asked several times on this podcast, and one of the things that still confuses me, is do they actually believe this stuff? Like I say, you've met some of these dudes now. I mean, you know, you've spoken to them, you've been around them. Do you get the feeling that they actually believe the trickle-down economics, for example, actually works, given that it's been so constantly disproven to be complete nonsense? I mean, you know, what's your feeling?
We were actually talking about this in my office the other day. Like, do they actually believe this? Do they, when trickle-down economics has just been so proven to be a myth, do they believe it, or are they? I don't know. I mean, what I think it is that they understand their class interests.
Right.
It's like, who was it who said that the Tories never talk about class war because they're too busy waging it? But they understand whose interests they're here to represent, what benefits them, and what benefits big businesses, landlords, and yeah, that's the mission that they're here for. So we on the other side, on the left, we need to be standing up for our class interests, whether that's Parliament, fighting for a much better deal for working people, fighting to scrap anti-union laws and for a proper minimum wage of something that's more like £15 an hour rather than 10.
Yeah.
Or whether it's on the picket lines, because as much as we're desperate for a Labour government, and the country really is desperate for a Labour government, we're not going to get one tomorrow unless there's an election happening that we haven't been told about. And people in the here and now need to win better wages and better terms and conditions for themselves. And the only way of doing that is joining a union and going on strike.
Bloody hell, mate, this is radical stuff for 2022. Are politicians allowed to say things like this anymore? Well, I was going to ask you.
Sorry, I just had something come up on my phone. Sorry.
Better be an important email or something.
No, it's just my group chat.
WhatsApp group?
Yeah.
Social or business?
Like friends from home. You're
not allowed to have friends. You're an MP now. Come on, you're supposed to be, work.
No joy whatsoever.
Exactly. You can't be enjoying yourself. You're not a human. You can't be doing normal stuff. What's going on?
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's all right. I mean, do you want to take 5 and take a few calls as well while we're here? Or?
No, they can wait. I did that shit.
Well, we for those people listening, you can't see. We both turned our cameras off at the start of the conversation in order to save the bandwidth for the audio, so that we don't get glitching. I do that sometimes, and I'm starting to think now that Nadia only wanted to do that so that she could send text messages to a WhatsApp group whilst we were doing the chat.
It's definitely not, and you can be assured of that because I'm not capable of it.
Well, we'll take your word for it. Well, I wanted to ask you, picking up on what you said about not having to, people can't wait, for the next election cycle in order to effect the changes that are going to affect their lives. I wanted to ask what your thoughts were then with regards to activist movements such as Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil and civil disobedience and civil activism more generally.
I think that when we look back at history, at groups that gave us rights that we have now, that won those rights, like the suffragettes, like the civil rights movement, they often took disruptive action that people were really angry about at the time and very hostile towards, but history has vindicated them. And I think it will look kindly on people who stood up and raised the alarm on the climate crisis when there was still time to do something about it. I think groups like that are extremely important, and the Labour Party should be kind of the party that is amplifying those messages. I've been really proud to support those kind of social movements in my constituency and like beyond as well, like the Kill the Bill movement, Black Lives Matter protest I went to in my constituency back in 2020. Just the other weekend I was at a rally for climate justice in Nottingham where people were recognising the joint crises that we have and the unfairness of it.
Good for you, man. I wish more politicians were saying things like this. The Kill the Bill campaign, I was involved a little bit in that. I did some performances for them. And one that I did with Jeremy Corbyn outside Parliament.
We probably saw each other.
Oh, were you there?
Yeah. In fact, I was at the very first one a couple of days before outside Scotland Yard. And then we marched to Parliament. Wow. It was incredible.
Yeah, it was a really good campaign, and a really good movement, and it really felt like it was going to be effective as well, because the ones that I went to, there was loads of people there, man. You know what I mean? Like say, Jeremy Corbyn would get up and speak, and there was all sorts of other awesome like campaigners and stuff, and I would do a few tunes, and there was loads of people, and it was a really consistent and relentless campaign as well. It really felt like this is people power at its best. And then when it went to the Lords, and they were sending they were rejecting it and sending it back amendments, it felt like, oh wow, we might actually win this one, And then when it went through and they passed it and made, effectively made public protest a criminal act, it felt a bit like, why isn't this front page of every newspaper and news channel in the country? You know what I mean?
And it's the reason why they're cracking down on protest and they're cracking down on trade unions taking action, is that they're scared of the power that people have when they come together and make demands. They know that protest works, that industrial action works, and that's why they don't want people to do it. So we've got to keep defending those rights by going out on the streets and exercising them.
Yeah, damn right. When they when they said it was going to be going through, I tweeted, which is the extent of my influence, because that's all that I could do. I said, we've got to go out and make more noise, because one of the conditions was that if you're being noisy, then they could shut the protest down. I was like, well, then we've got to go out and make more noise, because that is the whole point of protest.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't ask, to be listened to. That's just not how change has ever happened. You have to do it, So I'm not sure if you would be able to say like publicly on a podcast like this, but I personally applaud like Just Stop Oil throwing soup over the Van Gogh painting, because what's more important, a painting or the impending destruction of the planet we live on, So these disruptive activist actions, I think, are becoming increasingly important in a country, if not a world, where the political process is being co-opted by something else.
I think that people say that, like protest can be annoying. And it's like, yeah, obviously it can be. Protest is kind of meant to be annoying. People didn't win their rights just by saying, like, oh, can I have the vote, please? And when we're looking at groups like XR and Just Stop Oil, whatever inconvenience they're causing, that pales in comparison to the impact that the climate crisis will have if we fail to take action.
What are your thoughts on the climate crisis? Because it seems to me like we are dangerously close to being past the point of no return now. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that COP27, which has come to a close, was overall just a complete failure. There was some progress on loss and damage, which was a really important win for climate justice campaigners. But ultimately, we don't have a concrete plan to keep global temperatures under 1.5 degrees. There's a total lack of ambition on fossil fuels. There's no commitment to phasing out or even phasing down fossil fuels beyond coal. Ultimately, I just think that the planet can't afford to have any more of these missed opportunities or these watered down pledges with no accountability. And we can see, can't we, that the climate crisis is already here, that people are already suffering the effects of it. It's not some thing in the future.
Yeah.
So, yeah, if world leaders don't step up, then history won't forgive them.
Yeah, you bang on, man. And tell me about the climate education bill.
So I've been working since I was elected on a climate education bill with school students from Teach the Future. And it's basically calling for climate education to be on the national curriculum and to be woven through like a golden thread. So across primary, secondary, vocational courses, because at the moment we only learn about climate change in optional subjects, so like GCSE geography and triple science. But we're saying it should be taught in every subject. So, for example, like food technology, learning about sustainable diets, sustainable food production, English, learning about pieces of text that have been written by people through like a climate change lens. Vocational courses as well, like plumbing courses, for example, learning how to install low carbon heating systems, all of that kind of thing. And I'm really pleased that we've got support from the Labour Party front bench, so it's now Labour Party policy that we will do this. And we've also got support from people on the Conservative benches too. So the chair of the Education Select Committee, the Environmental Audit Select Committee, and the Business and Energy Select Committee, who the Business Select Committee chair is a Labour MP, but the other two are Tories. So we've made really significant progress.
That is amazing, man. What a thing to have gotten up and running. You know, congrats to you, man, because that is such a great idea. And yeah, I mean, like when I was in school, you know, climate change wasn't even a thing. You know what I mean? It's like it didn't even exist. You know, the notion that we did anything remotely harmful to the environment was, you know, whilst we were spraying a gazillion gallons of hairspray on our 80s perms, you know, just didn't factor at all. You know what I mean? And to see how far the threat of climate change has advanced just in my lifetime, I think it's really, really important now that the new generations, the younger generations coming up now, do understand, you know, from a really young age, just how much everything has an environmental impact, from our diet and the food we eat and the way that it's grown, and transport and retail and you know, manufacturing and lifestyle and travel, and everything is connected to the environment. I think that's a really, really cool idea, man. So props to you for doing that.
And it's also about like recognizing that if our education system isn't equipping people to deal with the impacts of the climate crisis that are already here, to be part of the solution to the climate crisis, then it's completely failing them.
100%. Yeah, another great point, man. It is unfortunately the generations coming up now who stand to be the most disadvantaged by the damage done to the environment of my generation, and then of course the boomers, who we all love immensely. I personally, this issue freaks me out. I personally, when I look at the figures and I look at the science and I look at the trajectory, I personally wonder sometimes whether it's too late, and it's an issue that really bums me out and really, really worries me, because, you know, the middle of the century is not that far away. And it's your generation and the younger generation coming up behind you that is going to be at the prime of their life at that point. So, I mean, how do you feel about it? You know, are you hopeful?
I do feel hopeful. I don't get my hope from the government or from governments around the world, but I feel hopeful because of climate justice activists from school climate strikers demanding these things, and that there have been some wins, not enough wins and not fast enough. But I feel hopeful about the role that a Labour government will play in bringing down global emissions, because people say, oh, what we do doesn't matter if China isn't decarbonising or India isn't decarbonising. And obviously countries that are kind of so-called like more developed, who in many cases have benefited from the exploitation and colonisation of countries in the global south. Obviously, we need to be taking steps to decarbonise even faster than those other countries so that we meet our global targets.
Yeah, well, I think we've got a colonial debt to repay much of the rest of the world, in all honesty, in this country. And if that takes the form of having to take a lead on emissions reductions, then I think that's small change considering how much we've looted and exploited much of the global south in particular for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Yeah, and all countries need to decarbonise, but we need to lead the way.
Totally.
Because we have the wealth and the kind of economy that is equipped to be able to do that.
Well, I'm glad that you're hopeful, because ultimately that's all we've got, isn't it? You know, hope is the energy that keeps us fighting. You know what I mean? Even if it seems entirely futile at times. But like as you alluded to earlier, you know, you've got to take those wins, however small they may be, and use that as the fuel to keep you pushing uphill, because it's the only way anything's ever changed. And if you don't have hope and you don't have morale, then you've already lost the fight, you know? So I'm glad that you're hopeful, and I'm really, really glad that we've got the generation coming up now that we've got, because the younger generation now are absolutely awesome in my eyes. I think those guys are amazing.
Yeah, 100%.
But bringing it from the global back to the national, why are we in a cost of living crisis right now? Given everything that you just correctly said about the state of our economy being as strong as it is on the global stage, why are people unable to pay their gas bill?
So obviously part of it is a global crisis, that there's a global energy crisis. But when the Tories keep saying that, it ignores their own responsibility and their own part in this, because that isn't the full picture. So we know that prices were already going up. People's bills were already going up before Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. We were also particularly badly equipped to deal with these kind of global shocks because of 12 years of austerity. So things like the war in Ukraine, but also like the pandemic, we know that we were particularly badly equipped to deal with that because of austerity. That was why we didn't have enough PPE on the front lines.
Right.
That's why our health service and the social care sector was completely overwhelmed, because it had been underinvested in and cut and overstretched over the last decade.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the causes of it. But if we're thinking about the solutions, what we can't do is keep making cuts. Everyone knows that if you're in a recession, you can't keep cutting. That's like trying to get yourself out of a hole by digging even deeper. It doesn't work. It just shrinks the economy, and then people suffer even more. So what the government should be doing instead is investing to grow the economy, investing in our public services so that they're more resilient. That also means that businesses are more likely to want to invest, because they don't just look at things like taxation, they also look at kind of the broader picture, like what are health outcomes like, what's inequality like, what are public services like in the places that they're wanting to invest. And then on taxation, the government needs to be taxing the right people. You can't increase taxes on people whose wages haven't gone up since 2008.
Yeah.
You have to be taxing people who can afford to pay more. So that means taxing the billionaires who've increased their profits by 55 billion every year. It means taxing the corporations who've been cashing in on the energy crisis and on the cost of living crisis. I think it was the CEO of BP who described the cost of living crisis as a cash machine.
Wow.
Well, not for people I represent, for him and his shareholders, sure, but that just shows that they need to be properly taxed. Also, things like closing tax loopholes. So one of the things that the Labour Party has pledged is that we'd close the non-dom tax loophole, which is basically it's the loophole that allows you to live in this country but pay your taxes somewhere else to avoid tax. It's what Rishi Sunak's wife used to avoid paying tax in this country. And the really sad thing, and the thing that makes me so angry, is that every penny that we lose in tax avoidance, we're losing from our NHS, from our education system, from being able to invest in infrastructure. So yeah, that's what I think the problems and the solutions are.
Boom. Jesus, nailed it, man, from every angle. Yeah, no further questions, Your Honour. Love it. Well, Nadia, look, I know that you've got to go, so I want to squeeze in one last question just before I let you go. I'd like to get a feel, for those that don't know, what Nadia Whittome's personal manifesto is. What is it that Nadia Whittome stands for?
I guess the really radical idea that people should be able to live comfortably and have proper control in their lives. The vast majority of people are struggling in some way or not having it as good as we could have it. And that's because of those at the top creaming off the profits from people's labour, exploiting workers, exploiting the planet. And I want a world where we have a planet that we can live on, where people can live comfortably and happily, where people are paid properly for their work and can access the services that they need. And particularly where I think people who are very marginalised, like sex workers, trans people, disabled people, people of colour, have power and have a seat at the table.
Amen. Man, I'm so glad I asked. Nadia, I know you've got to go because I know your assistant is lingering and you've got to run to your next meeting. So thank you so much for giving us your time. I really do appreciate it. It's been so fun to meet you and to chat with you. Thank you once again for the brilliant and tireless work that you do. You're definitely on the right side of history and we appreciate you, man. I want you to know that.
Well,
if I lived in Nottingham East, you'd have my vote without a shadow of a doubt. Don't ever let them steal your fire and keep making those old men uncomfortable for us.
Thank you so much. It's been so fun talking to you.
Nadia Whittome, ladies and gentlemen, Member of Parliament for Nottingham East. Let's hear it for her. Man, she dropped some truth bombs throughout that chat, man. It was good to hear some good old traditional Labour values being promoted there after the party that we all know and love has been besieged for so long by, the Blairites and the careerists and the backstabbers, And it's so nice to hear that kind of sense of optimism and hope and fight and fire that Nadia's got. And I really hope that she continues to scare those dusty old men that are way too comfortable in that job half to death. You see, they're not all bad, man. They're not all bad. If you want to follow Nadia on Twitter, you can check her out at Nadia Whittome MP. That is NADIAWHITTOME MP. Go and show us some love and support. It's very important on social media for the people that support you to actually show up and show that support, because the trolls are working overtime, baby, trust me. If the people that say they support me and agree with me were anywhere near as active and energetic as the trolls who hate me, then I'd have a bit more of a spring in my step some days. As always, I hope you enjoyed the chat. Even if you don't agree, I hope it was still good food for thought and stimulus for debate. And as always, if you could help me out by hitting the subscribe button and hitting some star ratings and just generally hitting some stuff, that'd be awesome. Unless, of course, you happen to be either of the 3 police officers that I've mentioned at the start of this, in which case you fuckers need to stop hitting everything right away. As I said, lots more to come on that escapade, just watch this space. And in the meantime, as always, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and I shall see you next time. Love ya.